Hi, welcome to Reader Woman's channel. My name's Judy and this is Wodehouse Wednesday. And we're reading The Truth About George from the Meet Mr. Mulliner set of short stories. Anyways, I have this lovely little edition. And why Wodehouse? I think we need laughter. I think we need joy, and as well as facing the hard truths and asking hard questions. I think that that we need a balance. And with my country and the state it is, I feel like a laugh is called for. So that is why, plus I love P.G. Wodehouse. I didn't read him until I was a young woman. So I was out of college, and I think they were publishing mass markets, and I found one in the like supermarket or a store, and I just picked it up and started reading and have just enjoyed him ever since. Plus he is, for his genre, humor, he is a genius. He truly is. And I hope that you either know all about him and are anxious to talk about him, or you don't know anything about him, and we will find out more. So I read you the introduction about Mr. Mulliner, who is always to be found at the Angler's Rest, a little cozy bar where the anglers go to talk and brag. So Mr. Mulliner is there to meeting a new stranger and is willing to share a story about his nephew, George. George, unfortunately, has a stutter. And let me just... my nephew George, said Mr. Mulliner, was as nice a young fellow as you would ever wish to meet, but from childhood up he had been cursed with a terrible stammer. If he had had to earn his living, he would undoubtedly have found this affliction a great handicap, but fortunately his father had left him a comfortable income, and George spent a not unhappy life, residing in the village where he had been born and passing his days in the usual country sports, and his evenings in doing crossword puzzles. By the time he was 30, he knew more about Eli, the prophet, Ra, the sun god, and the bird emu than anyone else in the county, except Susan Blake, the vicar's daughter, who had also taken up the solving of crossword puzzles and was the first girl in Worcestershire to find out the meaning of stearine and crepuscular. So George falls in love with Susan. And let's see here. He realized that she was all the world to him, or as he put it to himself from force of habit, precious, beloved, darling, much loved, highly esteemed, or valued. And yet every time he tried to tell her so, he could get no farther than a sibilant gurgle, which was no more practical use than a hiccup. Something obviously had to be done, and George went to London to see a specialist. And so he talks to the specialist, and who tells him that what he needs to do in order to talk to the specialist is to sing. So he breaks out into song and tells the doctor that he loves this young woman and he wants to ask her to marry him, but he stammers so badly that he can't do it. And so the doctor tells him that it's not an unusual case. I've had to deal with this sort of thing before. The effect of love on the vocal cords of even a normally eloquent subject is frequently deleterious. As regards the habitual stammerer, tests have been shown that in 97.569 recurring of cases, the divine passion reduces him to a condition where he sounds like a soda water siphon trying to recite Gunga Din. There is only one cure. Let's see here. The advice I give to all young men who come in here behaving like soda water siphons is to go out and make a point of speaking to at least 3 perfect strangers every day. Sorry. Engage these strangers in conversation, persevering no matter how priceless a chump you may feel, and before many weeks are out, you will find that the little daily dose has had its effect. Shyness will wear off, and with it, the stammer. So, having requested the young man in a voice of the clearest timbre, free from all trace of impediment, to hand over a fee of 5 guineas, the specialist sent George out into the world. The more George thought about the advice he had been given, the less he liked it. He shivered in the cab that took him to the station to catch the train back to East Wopsley. So he gets on the train, and the compartment he was in was empty. And just as the train started to take off, a large, fierce-looking man got in. So George is preparing to talk to this stranger. But before he could do so, the man spoke. "The brother," he said, "seems to be taking a turn for the better, doesn't it?" So George, what is he to do? He sank back as if he had been hit between the eyes. The train had moved out of the dimness of the station by now, and the sun was shining brightly on the speaker, illuminating his knobbly shoulders, his craggy jaw, and above all, the shockingly choleric look in his eyes. To reply yes to such a man would obviously be madness. But to abstain from speech did not seem to be much better a policy. George's silence appeared to arouse the man's worst passions. His face had turned purple and he glared painfully. "I asked you a civil," he said rascally. "Are you deaf?" And so George played deaf. As all Mulliners have been noted for our presence of mind. To open his mouth, point to his tonsils, and utter a strangled gurgle was with George the work of a moment. So his first encounter on the train did not go very well. So he had to change trains in order to get back home to East Wopsley. And in doing so, there was time to just pass before the train took off. And as it was a lovely afternoon, George decided to take a little walk along the platform. And it was a lovely afternoon. The sun was gilding the platform with its rays, and a gentle breeze blew from the west. A little brook ran tinkling at the side of the road. Birds were singing in the hedgerows, and through the trees could be discerned dimly the noble facade of the county lunatic asylum. Soothed by his surroundings, George began to feel so refreshed that he regretted that in this wayside station there was no one present whom he could engage in talk. It was at this moment that the distinguished-looking stranger entered the platform. The newcomer was a man of imposing physique, simply dressed in pajamas, brown boots, and a mackintosh. In his hand he carried a top hat, and into this he was dipping his fingers, taking them out and then waving them in a curious manner to right and left. So George decides to speak up. Nice weather, he said. Glad you like it, said the stranger. I ordered it specially. George was a little puzzled by this remark, but he persevered. Might I ask what you're doing? Doing? With that her hat? Oh, this hat. I see what you mean. Just scattering largesse to the multitude, replied the stranger, dipping his fingers once more and waving them with a generous gesture. Devil of a bore, but it's expected of a man in my position. The fact is, he said, linking his arm in George's and speaking in a confidential undertone, I'm the Emperor of Abyssinia. That's my palace over there, he said, pointing through the trees. Don't let it go any farther. It's not supposed to be generally known. It was with a rather sickly smile that George now endeavored to withdraw his arm from that of his companion. But the other would have none of this aloofness. He seemed to be in complete agreement with Shakespeare's dictum that a friend, when found, should be grappled to you with hooks of steel. He held George in a vice-like grip and drew him into a recess of the platform. He looked about him and seemed satisfied. We are alone at last, he said. This fact had already impressed himself with sickening clearness on the young man. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time, said the stranger genially. Have you? Said George. Yes, I want your opinion of human sacrifices. George said he didn't like them. Why not? Asked the other, surprised. George said it was hard to explain. He just didn't. Well, I think you're wrong, said the Emperor. I know there's a school of thought growing up that holds your views, but I disapprove of it. I hate all this modern advanced thought. Human sacrifices have always been good enough for the emperors of Abyssinia, and they're good enough for me. Kindly step in here, if you please. So George manages to push the Emperor of Abyssinia in the coat closet, and he runs back to his train. But he's frightened that the Emperor, he would have locked the door, but he had no key to lock it with. So he went into his compartment and rolled under the seat. So we have George under the seat when this woman comes in and proceeds to sit in his carriage, well, whatever you call it. What is it called? Compartment. Yeah, his train compartment. Glancing along the floor, because he's under his seat, he perceived female ankles. The relief was enormous, but even in his relief, George, who was the soul of modesty, did not forget his manners. He closed his eyes. So this woman proceeds to seat herself, and George decides after a while that he's going to get up from under the seat and sit on top of the seat. Little as he knew of women, he was aware that, as a sex, they are apt to be startled by the sight of men crawling out from under the seats of compartments. He began his maneuvers by poking out his head and surveying the terrain. All was well. The woman in her seat across the way was engrossed in her paper. Moving in a series of noiseless wriggles, George extricated himself from his hiding place, and with a twist which would have been impossible to a man not in the habit of doing Swedish exercises daily before breakfast, heaved himself into the corner seat. The woman continued reading her paper. But you have to remember that George is a Mulliner, a dogged, honest Mulliner. And so he decides that he needs to take this opportunity of speaking to a stranger. He's only gotten one in so far today. And he goes, And having opened the ball, he smiled a winning smile and waited for his companion to make the next move. The move which his companion made was in an upwards direction and measured from 6 to 8 inches. She dropped her paper and regarded George with a pale-eyed horror. One pictures her a little in the position of Robinson Crusoe when he saw the footprint in the sand. She had been convinced that she was completely alone, and lo, out of space a voice had spoken to her. Her face worked, but she made no remark. George on his side was also feeling a little ill at ease. Women always increased his natural shyness. He never knew what to say to them. Then a happy thought struck him. He had just glanced at his watch and found the hour to be nearly 4:30. Women, he knew, loved a drop of tea about this time. And fortunately, there was in his suitcase a full thermos flask. "Pardon me, but I wonder if you would care for a cup of tea," was what he wanted to say. But as so often happened with him when in the presence of the opposite sex, he could get no further than a sort of sizzling sound like a cockroach calling to its young. So, then he remembers his visit to the specialist. And he decided to say it with music. That was the thing to do. And he delayed no longer. Tea for two, and two for tea, and me for you, and you for me. He was shocked to observe his companion turning Nile green. He decided to make his meaning clearer. "I have a nice thermos. I have a full thermos. Won't you share my thermos too? When skies are gray and you feel you are blue, tea sees the sun smiling through. I have a nice thermos. I have a full thermos. May I pour out some for you?" You will agree with me, I think, that no invitation could have been more happily put, but his companion was not responsive. With one last agonized look at him, she closed her eyes and sank back into her seat. Her lips had now turned a curiously gray-blue color, and they were moving feebly. She reminded George, who, like myself, was a keen fisherman, of a newly gaffed salmon. So now George has this woman who has fainted at the sight and sound of him. And he doesn't know what to do. So he decides he's going to pour himself a cup of tea. And so as he's proceeding to drink his tea, he unfortunately has the cup in his hand and the flask is beside him. And it's a train, and it has to turn a very sharp turn. And the thermos goes up in the air and comes down and explodes. And the woman shoots up from her bench where she has fainted. She grabs hold of the line to stop the train, and she pulls it. At that point, let's see here. It is a curious thing that, in spite of the railway company's sporting willingness to let their patrons have a tug at the extremely moderate price of £5 a go, very few people have either pulled a communication cord or seen one pulled. There is thus a widespread ignorance as to what precisely happens on such occasions. The procedure, George tells me, is as follows. First, there comes a grinding noise as the brakes are applied. Then the train stops, and finally, from every point of the compass, a seething mob of interested onlookers begins to appear. So, all of a sudden, all of these people are surrounding the train that's just suddenly stopped on its way to East Wobsley. And it's difficult to say precisely what it would have been the correct behavior of your polished man of the world in such a situation. I think myself that a great deal of sang-froid and address would be required even by the most self-possessed in order to pass off such a contrivance. To George, I may say at once, the crisis revealed itself immediately as one in which he was totally incapable of handling. The one clear thought that stood out from the welter of his emotions was a reflection that it was advisable to remove himself and to do so without delay. Drawing a deep breath, he shot swiftly off the mark. All we Mulliners have been athletes, and George, when at the university, had been noted for his speed of foot. He ran now as he had never run before. His statement, however, that as he sprinted across the first field, he distinctly saw a rabbit shoot an envious glance at him as he passed and shrug its shoulders helplessly, I am inclined to discount. George, as I have said before, was a little overexcited. And here, I think, is where Wodehouse just shows his brilliance. It is impossible for one who is not an eyewitness to say how long the chase continued and how much ground was covered by the interested parties. I know the East Wapsley country well, and I have checked George's statements. And if it is true that he traveled east as far as Little Wigmarsh on the Dell and as far west as Higgleford come Whortleberry beneath the hill, he must undoubtedly have done a lot of running. But a point which must not be forgotten is that, to a man not in a condition to observe closely, the village of Higgleford come Whortleberry beneath the hill might easily not have been Higgleford come Whortleberry beneath the hill at all, but another hamlet which in many respects closely resembles it. I need scarcely say that I allude to Lesser Snodsbury in the Vale. So, poor George is out there running. We're not quite sure. We speculate, but we're not quite sure. All around the countryside, trying to get back to his home in East Wobblesbury, and to definitely keep out of the clutches of the man running after him with the pitchfork. So let's see here. A damp and bedraggled figure might have been observed crawling painfully along the high street of East Wapsley in the direction of the closey little cottage known to its builder as Chatsworth and to the village tradesmen as Mulliners. It was George, home from the hunting field. So George made it home ahead of the posse after him. And as he's pouring himself a drink, he sees a slim, fair girl, tastefully attired in tailor-made tweeds, leaning over the desk on which he kept his dictionary of English synonyms. She looked up as he entered, startled. Why, Mr. Mulliner, she explained, what has been happening? Your clothes are torn, rent, ragged, tattered, and your hair is all disheveled, untrimmed, hanging loose or negligently at loose ends. George smiled a wan smile. You are right, he said, and what is more, I'm suffering from extreme fatigue, weariness, lassitude, exhaustion, prostration, and languor. The girl gazed at him, a divine pity in her soft eyes. I'm so sorry, she murmured, so very sorry, grieved, distressed, afflicted, pained, mortified, dejected, and upset. George took her hand, and he realized at that moment he was no longer a stammerer. Had he wished at that moment to say Peter Piper picked a peck of pick-a-blippers, he could have done it without a second thought. But he had a better thought, better things to say than that. Miss Blake, Susan, Susie. He took her other hand in his. His voice rang out clear and unimpeded. It seemed to him incredible that he had ever yammered at this girl like an overheated steam radiator. It cannot have escaped your notice that I have long entertained towards you sentiments warmer and deeper than those of ordinary friendship. It is love, Susan, that has been animating my bosom. Love, first a tiny seed, has burgeoned in my heart, till, blazing into flame, it has swept away on the crest of its wave my diffidence, my doubt, my fears, and my foreboding. And now, like the topmost topaz of some ancient tower, it cries to all the world in a voice of thunder, you are mine, my mate, predestined to me since time first began. As a star guides the mariner, wind battered by boiling billows, he hies him home to the haven of hope and happiness. So do you gleam upon me along life's rough road and seem to say, Have courage, George. I am here. Susan, I am not an eloquent man. I cannot speak fluently as I could wish, but these simple words which you have just heard come from the heart, from the unspotted heart of an English gentleman. Susan, I love you. Will you be my wife, married woman, matron, spouse, helpmeet, consort, partner, or better half? Oh, George, said Susan, yes. Yea, aye, aye. Decidedly, unquestionably, indubitably, incontrovertibly, and past all dispute. And so the lovers are united. But then, from the street outside came the sound of feet and voices. George leaped to the window, rounding the corner just by the Cowman Wheelbarrow public house, licensed to sell ales, wines, and spirits, was the man with the pitchfork, and behind him followed a vast crowd. My darling, said George, for purely personal and private reasons, I must now leave you. And she's like, oh, I will follow you. It's not necessary. I'm only going down to the coal cellar. Tied up for the next half hour. But as we know, George and Susan lived happily ever after in the Mulliner universe. Hope you enjoyed this. Next week, it will be A Slice of Life. Bye.